Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading part four of Marcus Garvey and the Vision of Africa, Marcus Garvey and His Critics, commentaries by John Henrik Clarke and W.E.B. Du Bois. We'll be starting on page 195.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Greetings to Anthony McPhail and the forecast. Thanks for tuning in. Marcus Garvey and His Critics. Commentary by John Henrik Clarke. Marcus Garvey's manner of dealing with those who had disagreed with him seemed to have been designed to create adversaries, of which there were many. While the best known of these adversaries were W.E.B. Du Bois and W.A. Domingo, he had several lesser known opponents. The main article in this section was written by Richard B. Moore, who lived through the rise and fall of the Garvey era. Mr. Moore, formerly a member of the Communist Party, was in opposition to Marcus Garvey because at that time, a lot of the Black radicals were either communist or socialist inclined, and they thought of Marcus Garvey's movement as a negation of this ideology. Some of Marcus Garvey's critics had formerly been his supporters. Greetings, KW Don 7. In the United States, Marcus Garvey moved into an atmosphere that in some ways was being prepared for him before he was born. He managed to strike the right chords in the temperament of Black Americans and achieved what other leaders had not achieved. He managed to build a Black mass movement where others had failed. Some of his critics were those who had failed. In the rapid rise of the Garvey movement, some of the observers acted as though they were witnessing the impossible and had to deny it. It is generally assumed that the greatest opposition to Marcus Garvey came from the NAACP and Dr. Du Bois. This is not true. Opposition to his program and his teachings came from many quarters, including the Caribbean community in the United States and abroad. Opposition to Marcus Garvey by the Black working class was practically non-existent. Now that we know what class of people opposed Marcus Garvey, the next question is why? Dr. Du Bois and the NAACP did not at first oppose Marcus Garvey. The Crisis published fine articles on Marcus Garvey, The first two appeared in March of 1920 and January of 1921 and ended with, to sum up, Garvey is a sincere, hard-working idealist. He is also a stubborn, domineering leader of the mass. He has worthy industrial and commercial schemes, but he is an inexperienced businessman. End quote. The third and fourth articles dealt with the Black Star Line and the Universal Negro Improvement Association and were based on the published documents with little comment. It was not until September of 1922 that the crisis had a sharp word of criticism. This was based on Garvey's threats against his critics, his connection with the Ku Klux Klan, and his distribution of pamphlet propaganda against American Negroes. Quoted among other things was, "The white race can best help the Negro by telling him the truth and not by flattering him to believe that he is as good as any white man." The crisis commented, "Not even Tom Dixon or Ben Tillman or the hatefulest enemies of the Negroes have ever stooped to a more vicious campaign than Marcus Garvey, sane or insane, is carrying on. He is not attacking white prejudice, he is groveling before it and applauding it. His only attack is on men of his own race who are striving for freedom. His only contempt is for Negroes. His only threats are for black blood." On the other hand, Garvey's attacks on the NAACP in pages of the Negro World were continuous and, according to the NAACP, preposterous. Some of the charges he made against them, the NAACP, were: one, that they kept his representative from activity in Paris in 1919. Two, that Moorfield's story came from Boston to secure his conviction in 1924. Three, that the collapse of the Black Star Line came about because men were paid to make this trouble by certain organizations calling themselves Negro Advancement Associations. They paid men to dismantle our machinery and otherwise damage it so as to bring about the downfall of the movement. Four, that the NAACP was responsible for his incarcerations and deportation. The NAACP denied all of the charges. Forecast wants to know, when they say the Crisis Magazine, they mean W.E.B. Du Bois. Yes. Greetings, Bwana Haguziki. How are you tonight? All Black intellectuals did not oppose Garvey. Some of the most able in America supported him. To name a few: William F. Harris, author of The African Abroad; T. Thomas Fortune, editor of the Negro World from 1923 until his death in 1927; and Hubert Harrison, one of the foremost Afro-American intellects of his time. Some Black intellectuals were sufficiently interested in the Garvey movement to ally themselves with it at one time or another. Emmett J. Scott, for example, became Duke of the Nile in Garvey's visualized African empire. Another cause for opposition was Garvey's repatriation schemes. Black Americans have been divided on this issue since the early days of the 19th century. This was the period when the African colonization movement began. In his article, The Negro Intellectuals: Criticism of Garveyism, Charles Willis Simmons describes Garvey's early days in Harlem and with the introduction of his program. Garvey brought his program of Negro Zionism to New York on March 23rd of 1916. There, among the transplanted, poorly educated, superstitious, and disillusioned Southern Negroes, he found fanatical supporters for his schemes. He made use of each opportunity to present his beliefs. On one occasion, he was invited to speak for the organization of a Liberty League at Bethel AME Church. His speech, when it came, was not for such a large league. but for was not for such a league, but for the Universal Negro Improvement Association and its programs. On this occasion, Garvey was introduced by Hubert Harrison, founder of the Liberty League. This black socialist, who was also a nationalist, had a profound influence on the thinking of Marcus Garvey during the formative years of his movement in America. George S. Schuyler, then a young man, but later a severe journalistic critic of the foibles of the American Negro, in a letter to the editor of The Messenger, wrote of Garvey, "An ass was created to be ridden. Keep on riding Garvey by all means. Remember the much quoted maxim of Mr. P.T. Barnum, and don't let up, Brother Marcus, as long as he continues his mess, lest more foolish Negroes be taken in by this sable Ponzi." When Williams Pickens, field organizer for the NAACP, was offered a position in the UNIA, he refused, saying, "I cannot feel myself quite bad enough to accept any honor or alliance with such organizations as the Ku Klux Klan or the Black Hand Society. You compare the aim of the KKK in America with your aim in Africa, and if that be true, no civilized man can endorse either of you." Later, Pickens gave additional expression to his contempt of the alliance between Garveyism and the KKK. Hence, Pickens is distorting the facts. There was never any alliance between Marcus Garvey and the Ku Klux Klan. Dr. Du Bois, in later years, described the movement as a grandiose and bombastic scheme, utterly impractical as a whole, but Du Bois considered the movement sincere and said of Garvey that he proved not only an astonishingly popular leader, but a master of propaganda, displaying even greater admiration for the leader of the UNIA and seemingly refusing to acknowledge that the profound impact of that organization had fallen upon the United States Negroes. Du Bois wrote that Garvey had made vocal the great and long suffering grievances and spirit of protest among the West Indian peasantry. He describes the UNIA as, quote, "one of the most interesting spiritual movements of the modern world." Other Black intellectuals who at first had been overtly critical of Marcus Garvey began to look at him with more respect. E. Franklin Frazier in 1926, commenting upon Garvey and his movement, wrote, "As a leader of a mass movement among Negroes, Garvey has no equal." Later, in 1949, Frazier described Garvey as being the leader of the most important, though ephemeral, nationalistic movement among Negroes. Alan Locke, in The New Negro, saw in Garveyism the sense of a mission of rehabilitating the race in world esteem from the loss of prestige for which the fate and conditions of slavery have so largely been responsible. Garveyism may be a transient, if spectacular, phenomenon, but the possible role of the American Negro in the future development of Africa is one of the most constructive and universally helpful missions that any modern people can lay claim to. A. Philip Randolph, one of Garvey's persistent opponents, pointed out that the UNIA had stirred Negroes to the realization of the need for organization and had demonstrated the ability of Negroes to organize under Negro leadership. Randolph credited Garvey and his organization with having aided in the destruction of the slave psychology which throttles and strangles Negro initiative. One Negro intellectual, observing the impression which Garvey was making upon the American Negro, said that whatever may happen to his grandiose schemes of finance and politics, he is the best point at which to study what is going on inside the hearts of 10 million colored people in the United States. James Weldon Johnson believed that if Garvey had possessed a more tactful personality and had used more modern moderation, he would have been successful in his Back to Africa movement. He had wrote Johnson, energy and daring of the Napoleonic personality, the personality that draws masses of followers. He had great power and possibilities within his grasp, but his deficiencies as a leader outweighed his abilities. To this man came an opportunity such as comes to few men, and he clutched greedily at the glitter and let the substance slip from his fingers. The reprisal of Marcus Garvey went on for years until some of his original critics and opponents became defenders of his movement. And now, the one that we've all been waiting for, Marcus Garvey by W.E.B. Du Bois, published in The Crisis magazine, December 1920, pages 58 through 60, and January 1921, pages 112 through 115. So this is what W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about Garvey. Marcus Garvey was born in St. Ann's Bay, Jamaica, about 1885. He was educated at the public school and then for a short time attended the Church of England grammar school, although he was a Roman Catholic by religion. On leaving school, he learned the printing trade and followed it for many years. In Costa Rica, he was associated with Markham Taylor in publishing the Bluefields Messenger. Later, he was on the staff of La Nation. Then he then returned to Jamaica and worked as a printer, being a foreman of the printing department of P. Benjamin's Manufacturing Company of Kingston. Later, he visited Europe and spent some time in England and France, and while abroad, conceived his scheme of organizing the Negro Improvement Society. This society was launched August 1st, 1914, in Jamaica, with these general objects, among others: to establish a universal confraternity among the race, to promote the spirit of race pride and love, to administer to and assist the needy, to strengthen the imperialism of independent African states, to conduct a worldwide commercial and industrial intercourse. His first practical object was to be the establishment of a farm school. Meetings were held, and the Roman Catholic bishop, the mayor of Kingston, and many others addressed him. Nevertheless, the project did not succeed, and Mr. Garvey was soon in financial difficulties. He therefore practically abandoned the Jamaica field and came to the United States. In the United States, his movement for many years languished until at last, with the increased migration from the West Indies during the war, he succeeded in establishing a strong nucleus in the Harlem district of New York City. Greetings, Pro Black Perspective. Oni, how are you tonight? Thanks for tuning in. His program, now enlarged and changed somewhat in emphasis, he began especially to emphasize the commercial development of the Negroes, and as an islander familiar with the necessities of ship traffic, he planned the Black Star Line. The public for a long time regarded this as simply a scheme of exploitation when they were startled by hearing that Garvey had bought a ship. This boat was a former coasting vessel, 32 years old, but it was put into commission with a black crew and a black captain and was announced as the first of a fleet of vessels which would trade between the colored peoples of America, the West Indies, and Africa. With this beginning, the popularity and reputation of Mr. Garvey and his association increased quickly. In addition to the Yarmouth, he is said to have purchased two small boats, the Shady Side, a small excursion steamer, which made daily excursions up the Hudson, and a yacht, which was designed to cruise among the West Indies and collect cargo in some central spot for the Yarmouth. He had first announced the Black Star Line as a $5 million corporation. But in February 1920, he announced that it was going to be a $10 million corporation, with shares selling at $5. To this, he added in a few months the Negro Factories Corporation, capitalized at $1 million, with 200,000 $1 shares. And finally, he announced the subscription of $5 million to free Liberia and Haiti from debt. Early in 1920, he called a convention of Negroes to meet in New York City from the 1st to the 31st of August to outline a constructive plan and program for uplifting of the Negroes and the redemption of Africa. He also took title to 3 apartment houses to be used as offices and purchased the foundation of an unfinished Baptist church, which he covered over and used for meetings, calling it Liberty Hall. In August 1920, his convention met with representatives from various parts of the United States, several from the West India Islands and the Canal Zone, and a few from Africa. The convention carried out its plan of a month's meetings and culminated with a mass meeting which filled Madison Square Garden. Finally, the convention adopted a Declaration of Independence with 66 articles, a universal anthem, and colors red, black, and green, and elected Mr. Garvey as His Excellency, the Provisional President of Africa, together with a number of various leaders from the various parts of the Negro world. In this brief is the history of the Garvey movement. The question comes, 1, is it an honest and sincere movement? 2, are its industrial and commercial projects businesslike and effective? 3, are its general objects plausible and capable of being carried out? The central and dynamic force of the movement is Garvey. He has, with singular success, capitalized and made vocal the great and long-suffering grievances and spirit of protest among the West Indian peasantry. Hitherto, the Black peasantry of the West Indies has been almost leaderless. Its natural leaders, both mulatto and Black, have crossed the color line and practically obliterated social distinction and, to some extent, economic distinction between them and the white English world on the islands. These are the Black whites. This has left a peasantry with only the rudiments of education with almost no economic chances, groveling at the bottom. Their distress and needs gave Garvey his vision. It is a little difficult to characterize the man Garvey. He has been charged with dishonesty and graft, but he seems to me essentially an honest and sincere man with a tremendous vision, great dynamic force, stubborn determination, and unselfish desire to serve. But also, he has very serious defects of temperament and training. He is dictatorial, domineering, inordinately vain, and very suspicious. He cannot get on with his fellow workers. His entourage has continually changed. He has had endless lawsuits and, in some cases, fisticuffs with his subordinates, and has even divorced the young wife whom he married with great fanfare of trumpets about a year ago. All of these things militate against him and his reputation. Nevertheless, I have not found the slightest proof that his objects were not sincere or that he was consciously diverting money to his own uses. The great difficulty with him is that he has absolutely no business sense, no flair for real organization, and his general objects are so shot through with bombast and exaggeration that it is difficult to pin them down for careful examination. On the other hand, Garvey is an extraordinary leader of men. Thousands of people believe in him. He is able to stir with them he is able to stir them with singular eloquence, and the general run of his thought is of a high plane. He has become to thousands of people a sort of religion. He allows and encourages all sorts of personal adulation, even printing in his paper the address of some of the delegates who hailed him as His Majesty. He dons on state occasions a costume consisting of an academic cap and gown flounced in red and green. Of Garvey's curious credulity and suspicions, one example will suffice. In March 1919, he held a large mass meeting at Palace Casino, which was presided over by Chandler Owen and addressed by himself and Philip Randolph. There he collected $204 in contributions on the plea that while in France, W.E.B. Du Bois had interfered with the work of his High Commissioner by defeating his articles in the French press and repudiating his statements as to lynching and injustice in America. The truth was that Mr. Du Bois never saw or heard his high commissioner, never denied his nor anyone's statements of the wretched American conditions, did everything possible to arouse rather than quiet the French press, and would have been delighted to welcome and cooperate with any colored fellow worker. The pro Black perspective says, why are these haters? Why did Clark reprint these nobodies? Because this is W.E.B. Du Bois. And these are Du Bois's words that were printed in the Crisis magazine. When it comes to Mr. Garvey's industrial and commercial enterprises, there is more ground for doubt and misgiving than in the matter of his character. First of all, his enterprises are incorporated in Delaware, where the corporation laws are loose and where no financial statements are required. So far as I can find, and I've searched with care, Mr. Garvey has never published a complete statement of the income and expenditures of the Negro Improvement Association or of the Black Star Line or of any of his enterprises, which really revealed his financial situation. A courteous letter of inquiry sent to him on July 22nd, 1920, asking for such financial data as he was willing for the public to know, remains to this day unacknowledged and unanswered. Now, a refusal to publish a financial statement is no proof of dishonesty, but it is proof that either Garvey is ill advised and unnecessarily courting suspicion, or that his industrial enterprises are not on a sound business basis. Otherwise, he is too good an advertiser not to use a promising balance sheet for all it's worth. Has been one balance sheet published, July 26, 1920, purporting to give the financial condition of the Black Star Line after 1 year of operation. Neither profit nor loss is shown. There is no way to tell the actual cash receipts or the true condition of the business. Nevertheless, it does make some interesting revelations. The total amount of stock subscribed is for 590,860,000. For $590,860. Of this, $118,153.28 is not yet paid for, leaving the actual amount of paid-in capital charged against the corporation as $472,706.72. Against this stands only $355,214.59 of assets, vis-a-vis $21,985.21 in cash deposits and loans receivable, $12,975.01 in furniture and equipment, $288,515.37, which is the alleged value of his boats, $26,000 in real estate, and $5,739 of insurance paid in advance. To offset the assets, he has $152,264.14 of other liabilities. Of accrued salaries, $1,539.30. Notes and accounts payable, $129,224.84. Mortgages due, $21,500. In other words, his capital stock of $472,706.72 is after a year's business impaired to such extent that he has only $202,950.45 to show for it. Even this does not reveal the precariousness of his actual business conditions. Banks before the war, in lending their credit, refused to recognize any business as safe unless for every dollar of current liabilities, there were $2 of current assets. Today, since the war, they require $3 of current assets to verify to every one of current liabilities. The Black Star Line had July 26, $16,485.21 in current assets and $130,764.14 in current liabilities. When recognition by any reputable bank called for $390,000 in current assets. Moreover, another sinister admission appears in this statement. The cost of floating the Black Star Line to date has been $289,066.27. In other words, it has cost nearly $300,000 to collect a capital of less than $500,000. Garvey has, in other words, spent more for advertisements than he has for his boats. This is a serious situation, and even this does not tell the whole story. The real estate, the furniture, etc., listed above are probably valued correctly. But how about the boats? The Yarmouth is a wooden steamer of 1,452 gross tons, built in 1887. It is old and unseaworthy. It came near to sinking a year ago, and it has cost a great deal for repairs. It is said that it is now laid up for repairs with a large bill due. Without doubt, the inexperienced purchasers of this vessel paid far more than it is worth, and it will soon be utterly worthless unless rebuilt at a very high cost. The cases of Kanawha or Antonio Maceo and the Shady Side are puzzling. Neither of these boats is registered as belonging to the Black Star Line at all. The former is recorded as belonging to C.L. Diamond and the latter to the North and East River Steamboat Company. Does the Black Star Line really own these boats, or is it buying them by installments and only leasing them? We do not know the facts that and have been unable to find out. Under the circumstances, they look like dubious assets. The majority of the Black Star stock is apparently owned by the Universal Negro Improvement Association. There is no reason why this association, if it will and can, should not continue to pour money into its corporation. Let us therefore consider then Mr. Garvey's other resources. Mr. Garvey's income consists of A, dues from members of the UNIA, B, shares in the Black Star Line and other enterprises, and C, gifts and loans for specific objects. If the UNIA has 3 million members, then the income from that source alone would certainly be over $1 million a year. If, as is more likely, it has under 300,000 paying members, he may collect $150,000 annually from this source. Stock in the Black Star Line is still being sold. Garvey himself tells of one woman who had saved about $400 in gold. She brought out all the gold and bought shares in the Black Star Line. Another man writes this touching letter from the Canal Zone. I have sent twice to buy shares amounting to $125. Numbers of certificates 3752 and 9617. I am now sending $35 for 7 more shares. You might think I have money, but the truth, as I stated before, is that I have no money now. But if I'm to die of hunger, it will be all right because I'm determined to do all that's in my power to better the conditions of my race. So people had hope. In addition to this, he has asked for special contributions. In the spring of 1920, he demanded for his coming convention in August a fund of $2 million to capitalize this, the greatest of all conventions. In October, he acknowledged a total of something over $16,000 in small contributions. Immediately, he announced a constructive loan of $2 million, which he is presumably still seeking to raise. From these sources of income, Mr. Garvey has financed his enterprises and carried on a wide and determined propaganda, maintained a large staff of salaried officials, clerks, and agents, and published a weekly newspaper. Notwithstanding this considerable income, there is no doubt that Garvey's expenditures are pressing hard on his income, and that his financial methods are so essentially unsound that unless he speedily revises them, the investors will certainly get no dividends and worse may happen. He is apparently using the familiar method of kiting. In other words, the money which comes in as investment in stock is being used in current expenses, especially in heavy overhead costs for clerk hire, interest, and display. Even his boats are being used for advertisement more than for business, lying in harbors as exhibits, taking excursion parties, and etc. These methods have necessitated mortgages on property and continually new and more grandiose schemes to collect larger and larger amounts of ready cash. Meantime, lacking businessmen of experience, his actual business ventures have brought in few returns, involved heavy expense, and threatened him continually with disaster or legal complication. On the other hand, full credit must be given to Garvey for a bold effort and some success. He has at least put vessels manned and owned by Black men on the seas, and they have carried passengers and cargoes. The difficulty is that he does not know the shipping business. He does not understand the investment of capital, and he has few trained and staunch assistants. The present financial plight of an inexperienced and headstrong promoter may therefore decide the fate of the whole movement. This would be a calamity. Garvey is the beloved leader of tens of thousands of poor and bewildered people who have been cheated all their lives. His failure would mean a blow to their faith and a loss of their little savings, which would take generations to undo. Moreover, shorn of its bombast and exaggeration, the main lines of the Garvey plan are perfectly feasible. What he is trying to say and do is this: American Negroes can, by accumulating and ministering their own capital, organize industry, join the Black centers of the South Atlantic by commercial enterprise, and in this way ultimately redeem Africa as a fit and free home for Black men. This is true. It is feasible. It is, in a sense, practical, but it will take for its accomplishment long years of painstaking, self sacrificing effort. It will call for every ounce of ability, knowledge, experience, and devotion in the whole Negro race. It is not a task for one man or one organization, but for coordinate effort on the part of millions. The plan is not original with Garvey, but he has popularized it, made it a living, vocal ideal, and swept thousands with him with the intense belief in the possible accomplishment of the ideal. This is a great human service. But when Garvey forges ahead and almost single handedly attempts to realize his dream in a few years with large words and great gestures, he grievously minimizes his task and endangers his cause. To instance one illustrative fact, there is no doubt but what Garvey has sought to import to America and capitalize the antagonism between blacks and mulattoes in the West Indies. This has been the cause of the great West Indian failures to gain headway against the whites. Yet Garvey imports it into a land where it has never had any substantial footing and where today, of all days, it is absolutely repudiated by every thinking Negro. Garvey capitalizes it, has sought to get the cooperation of men like R. Moulton on his basis, and has aroused more bitter colored enmity inside the race than has ever before existed. The whites are delighted at the prospect of division of our solidifying phalanx, but their hopes are in vain. American Negroes recognize no color line in or out of the race, and they will in the end punish the man who attempts to establish it. Then, too, Garvey increases his difficulty in other directions. He is a British subject. He wants to trade in British territory. Why then does he needlessly antagonize and even insult Britain? He wants to unite all Negroes. Why then does he sneer at the work of the powerful group of his race in the United States where he finds asylum and sympathy? Particularly, why does he decry the excellent and rising business enterprises of Harlem, intimating that his schemes alone are honest and sound when the facts flatly contradict him? He proposes to settle his headquarters in Liberia, but has he asked permission of the Liberian government? Does he presume to usurp authority in a land which has successfully withstood England, France, and the United States, but is expected tamely to submit to Marcus Garvey? How long does Mr. Garvey think that President King would permit his anti English propaganda on Liberian soil when the government is straining every nerve to escape the lion's paw? And finally, Without arms, money, effective organization, or base of operations, Garvey openly and wildly talks of conquest and of telling white Europeans in Africa to get out and the becoming himself a Black Napoleon. Suppose Mr. Garvey should drop from the clouds and concentrate on his industrial schemes as a practical first step towards his dreams. The first duty of this great commercial enterprise is to carry on effective commerce. A man who sees in industry the key to a situation must establish sufficient business-like industries. Here, Mr. Garvey has failed lamentably. The Yarmouth, for instance, has not been a commercial success. Stories have been published alleging its dirty condition and the inexcusable conduct of its captain and crew. To this, Mr. Garvey may reply that it was no easy matter to get efficient persons to run his boats and to keep a schedule. This is certainly true, but if it is difficult to secure one Black boat crew, how much more difficult is it going to be to build and operate factories in the big industrial centers of the United States, Central America, and the West Indies and Africa to manufacture every marketable commodity, and also to purchase and build ships of larger tonnage for the African and South American trade, and also to raise $5 million to free Liberia, where new buildings are to be erected, administrative buildings are to be built, colleges and universities are to be constructed, and finally to accomplish what Mr. Garvey calls the conquest of Africa. To sum it up, Garvey is a sincere, hard-working idealist. He is also a stubborn, domineering leader of the mass. He has worthy industrial and commercial schemes, but he is an inexperienced businessman. His dreams of Negro industry, commerce, and the ultimate freedom of Africa are feasible, but his methods are bombastic, wasteful, illogical, and ineffective, and almost illegal. If he learns by experience, attracts strong and capable friends and helpers instead of making needless enemies, if he gives up the secrecy and suspicion and substitutes open and frank reports as to his income and expenses, and above all, if he is willing to be a co-worker and not a czar, he may yet in time succeed in at least starting some of his schemes toward accomplishment. But unless he does these things and does them quickly, he cannot escape failure. Let the followers of Mr. Garvey insist that he get down to bedrock business and make income and expense balance. Let them gag Garvey's wilder words and still preserve his wide power and influence. American Negro leaders are not jealous of Garvey. They are not envious of his success. They are simply afraid of his failure, for his failure would be theirs. He can have all the power and money that he can efficiently and honestly use. And if in addition he wants to prance down Broadway in a green shirt, let him. But do not let him foolishly overwhelm with bankruptcy and disaster one of the most interesting spiritual movements of the modern Negro world. And those were the words of W.E.B. Du Bois. Let me take a look at these comments. All right. Greetings, Sister Raw and Brother Bakari. How are you tonight? The forecast says some Black folk was put on that type of time way before YouTube. Pocket watching with Du Bois. Absolutely. I missed it. Is this the article where Du Bois says most of the UNIA is Caribbean? Yes, it is. Pocket watching is like a mafia. Tell me your finances. He ain't a, if he, like he ain't a spy. He is a spy. He is a spy. Tomorrow, The pocket watch is insane. It's a damn Rolex at this point. Yeah, he probably knew how much money he got more than the man wife. The mulatto talking about he knows business. He just sitting there watching the ship sink like Garvey ain't asked for help from jump. Only read Du Bois's biography. The biographer was like, Du Bois's trip and colorism was big in the US. Absolutely, colorism is big in the US, and it still is. Not mad at him saying, not mad at him saying not to antagonize England. They blocked him from traveling, but for all we know, Du Bois had a hand in it. I don't know who it was considered illegal by. The enemies of this man fought Booker T. Washington. He sabotaged Liberia with Firestone. And what did he say about the Caribbeans? He said that the Caribbeans were not on his side. He said, one moment, let me go back to it and I'll give you the exact words. He was talking about the fact that he didn't have any support from the West Indians, but at different times he says he had supporters from the India Islands in the Canal Zone. It was a little bit further up than I remember. One moment. He was colorist himself. All right, so Du Bois says, oh, it's a different quote where he said the West Indians were the majority. He meant as a disparage. Yeah, he did mean it as a disparaging comment because he talks about the West Indians being the black whites in this article because they didn't have any leaders of the Negro masses down there in the islands, and that Garvey was coming along with his ideology of colorism, trying to break up what the American Negro had, and Du Bois's implied that it wasn't as bad here in America as it was in the West Indies. Or at least that's what I took away from it. Did you guys? The next section is kind of long, so I'm going to save it until next week because I try really hard to only keep you guys for an hour. I thank each and every one of you for tuning in. I want to say peace to Anthony McPhail, The Forecast, KW Don 7, Pwana Hagaziki, Sister Raw, The Pro Black Perspective, and Brother Bakari, and even you listening in the future. I thank you and I value each and every one of you. I want to say thank you for my cash apps. Thank you, Brother Bakari, Afro Native, Bawana Haguziki, The Forecast, Sister Raw, Tinkerbell 87, and anyone else that I may have missed. I value each and every one of you, and I will see you Monday with part B, where we will be reading the words of Miller, I believe is who's next. Give me one moment. Let me scroll to that page. We'll be picking up on page 100, no, 215, I believe. One moment. We'll be picking up on page 210, and it's Richard B. Moore. Nope, not Kelly Miller, Richard B. Moore. We'll be going into The Critics and Opponents of Marcus Garvey by Richard B. Moore, who is one of the Yeah, Kelly Miller is that guy. I don't think that there are any Kelly Miller quotes in this book. I'll check. But Kelly Miller is that guy. So, yes, we'll be picking up on page 210 on Monday, continuing The Critics and Opponents of Marcus Garvey by Richard B. Moore. Thank you so much for tuning in, guys. I hope you have a great weekend. Peace.